I wasn't expecting to run into my past on my first day in the new apartment. After all, I had moved here for a fresh start, away from the mess of my old job, the drama of broken friendships, and most of all, the memory of him. 5 years had passed since James disappeared without a trace, and I had convinced myself that I'd moved on. But as I balanced a stack of moving boxes in my arms, struggling to unlock my door, fate had other plans. Claire. I froze. That voice, it was unmistakable. A voice I hadn't heard in years, but had once been as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. There he was, James, standing just a few feet away in the narrow hallway, looking at me like he'd seen a ghost. I nearly dropped the boxes in my arms. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. My throat felt tight, and my pulse quickened as 1,000 emotions surged to the surface. Shock, anger, confusion. His face hadn't changed much, still handsome in the rugged way I remembered. Dark hair, stubbled jawline, piercing green eyes. But there was something different about him now. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a heaviness in his posture that hadn't been there before. James, I finally managed, my voice sounding far more composed than I felt. What are you doing here? He blinked, his expression unreadable. I live here. Apartment 6A. My heart sank. Of course. Of all the buildings in the city, of all the apartments I could have moved into, James had to be living in the one right across the hall from me. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. I hadn't seen him in 5 years, and now, suddenly, here he was, looking at me like he didn't expect me to exist anymore. I just moved into 6B, I said stiffly, shifting the weight of the boxes in my arms, trying to maintain some level of composure. This is unexpected. You could say that, he muttered, running a hand through his hair and glancing around, as if searching for an exit. There was an awkward, tense silence. I couldn't stop staring at him. All the memories came rushing back, the long nights we'd spent together, the way he'd made me feel so safe, so certain of our future. And then, just like that, he was gone. No calls, no explanation, no goodbye. I had spent months after that breakup trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, I stopped asking why. Now, seeing him again, all those unanswered questions came roaring back. I thought you left the city, I said, my voice colder than I intended. James looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting away from mine. I did, for a while, but I had to come back. His vagueness only fueled my frustration. I had to come back. Why? Why now? Where had he been all this time? I opened my mouth to ask him, but something in his body language stopped me. He was shifting on his feet, his eyes flicking toward the end of the hallway, as if he was in a hurry to be anywhere but here. The confident, charming man I had once known was gone, replaced by someone nervous, jumpy. There was a tension about him that I didn't understand. Look, he said suddenly, his voice softer now. I know this is awkward, Claire, but I don't think. Don't think what? I cut him off, feeling a surge of irritation. That we should talk? You disappeared, James. You didn't think you owed me an explanation? The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I had promised myself that I wouldn't let him get to me again, that if I ever saw him, I would be indifferent. But seeing him here, looking as though he was the one caught off guard, was too much. 5 years of silence, and he acted like it was nothing. James flinched, his jaw tightening. It's complicated. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly, feeling the weight of all that unresolved hurt pressing down on me. You managed to do it anyway. He opened his mouth to respond, but then, just as quickly, he shut it again. For a moment, he looked like he might try to explain himself, like he might finally give me the answers I had spent years searching for. But instead, he took a step back, that same uneasy look flashing across his face. "I need to go," he said. His voice rushed now. "I have something I need to take care of." And just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hall before I could say another word. I stood there, stunned, my heart racing. It was like I'd been yanked back into a chapter of my life I thought I'd closed for good. And now, after 5 years of nothing, James had shown up again, just as suddenly as he had disappeared. Only this time, there was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I passed his door, I found myself listening, wondering if he was inside. I didn't want to care. I didn't want to get pulled back into the storm that had been our relationship, but I couldn't help it. There was something about the way he'd acted that gnawed at me, something that didn't sit right. He was never around. I would catch a glimpse of him once in a while, slipping out of the building in the early morning or returning late at night, always looking over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to be following him. He was different now, quieter, more closed off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then came the visitors. It was late one night when I first noticed them, 2 men in dark suits, standing outside James's door. I had just gotten home from a long day at work, and as I walked down the hall, I saw them knocking, their faces hard, their eyes scanning the hallway like they were looking for something or someone. I hesitated, hanging back around the corner, watching. James opened the door, and immediately, I could see the tension in his body. He glanced around, his eyes landing on the men with a mixture of fear and irritation. Their conversation was low, but I could hear bits and pieces of it through the thin walls of the hallway. "You're running out of time. This is your last chance, James. If you don't deliver, we'll find someone else who will." My heart raced as I strained to listen, but before I could catch any more, the door shut behind them. The men left, walking past me without even glancing in my direction. I stood there in the empty hallway, my mind spinning. What was James involved in? And why did it feel like I was about to get pulled into something much bigger than I had ever imagined? What do you think James is hiding? Would you try to find out, or leave the past behind? Let us know your thoughts below. The next morning, I woke up with a knot of unease twisting in my stomach. My brief encounter with James had stirred up so much, but the visit from those men, their low, ominous voices and James's reaction, left me shaken. My mind replayed their words like a broken record. "You're running out of time. This is your last chance." James was in trouble, and not the kind of trouble that ends with a simple apology or a few late bills. No, this was something far darker, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just ignore it. For days, I tried to put it out of my head. After all, it wasn't my problem anymore. James had made his choices, and I had spent years trying to heal from the damage his disappearance had caused. He was no longer part of my life. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself listening again, watching for him, hoping to find answers that would explain the questions swirling in my mind. The more I watched, the more I saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He was never home for long, always leaving in a rush, looking tense and on edge. Every time I saw him, he was checking his phone, darting quick glances at the people around him like he was waiting for something that scared him. I wasn't just imagining it. Whatever was going on, it was real, and James was right in the middle of it. A few nights later, I was leaving my apartment to grab some dinner when I heard voices coming from the hallway again. I paused, the knot in my stomach tightening as I edged closer to the door, straining to listen. It was James, and he wasn't alone. Another man's voice, low and menacing, echoed through the narrow corridor. "You think you can keep stalling? This isn't a game, James." "I told you I need more time," James replied, his voice thick with frustration. The stranger didn't sound convinced. "Time is something you don't have. The boss isn't happy, and when he's not happy, bad things happen. You know that. The knot in my stomach twisted painfully. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding as I tried to piece together what was happening. This was serious, far more serious than I had anticipated. James was in over his head, and it was clear these people weren't just going to walk away if he couldn't deliver whatever they wanted. I heard footsteps moving closer, the stranger's voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You've got 48 hours. If you don't have what we need by then, you're going to wish you'd never come back. There was a tense silence, and then the sound of the door slamming shut. I heard the stranger's heavy footsteps retreat down the hall, but I stayed where I was, frozen in place. 48 hours. Whatever was happening, James was on borrowed time. The next day, I saw James again. He was outside the building, sitting on the front steps, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, worn down by whatever weight he was carrying. Something inside me shifted. Despite everything, despite the years of hurt and the unanswered questions, I still cared about him. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by hiding behind my door. I walked up to him, my heart pounding. He didn't see me at first, too lost in his own thoughts. When I cleared my throat, he looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Claire," he said, quickly straightening up. "What are you?" "We need to talk," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know something's going on, James. I've seen the people coming to your apartment. I heard them last night. You're in trouble." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "It's none of your business." "None of my business?" I repeated, anger bubbling up. "You've been acting strange since the moment I moved in. I'm your neighbor, James. And whether you like it or not, you've dragged me into this by being here. So yeah, I'd say it is my business." For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes darted away, glancing down the street as if he was checking to see if anyone was watching us. Then, with a heavy sigh, he rubbed a hand over his face and stood up. "Fine," he muttered, "but not here. Come inside." Once we were back inside his apartment, I could feel the tension radiating off him. The place was sparsely furnished, and it looked like he hadn't unpacked most of his belongings. A few boxes were stacked in the corner, and the blinds were drawn, casting the room in a shadowy gloom. James sat down on the edge of the couch, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of whatever burden he was carrying. "You were right," he said after a long pause. "I'm in trouble." My heart raced as I sat down across from him, waiting for him to continue. For years, I had wanted to know why he had left, what had happened to make him vanish from my life without warning. And now, I was finally going to get the answers I'd been searching for. "What kind of trouble?" I asked softly. James looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. "After I left the city, I got involved with some people. People I shouldn't have trusted." "Who are they?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Criminals." I didn't know it at first. It started out as just a job, something to get by. But then, things got more complicated. I was working for them, helping them launder money. I thought I could get out when I realized what was really going on, but by then, it was too late. My stomach churned. Laundering money? I had never imagined that James could be involved in something like this. He had always been careful, responsible, but this was something else entirely. "So why did you come back?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why now?" James's face darkened. "Because they're after me. I took something from them, something they need to keep their operation running, and now they think I'm a threat. They've been hunting me for months, and when I came back here, I thought I could stay hidden. But I was wrong." My breath caught in my throat. "What did you take?" "A ledger," he said quietly. "It has all the details of their money laundering schemes. Names, accounts, everything. If I give it to the authorities, it could bring down their entire operation. But if I don't give it back to them, they'll kill me. And now they know you're here too." A wave of fear washed over me. What do you mean? How do they know about me? They've been watching, James said, his voice heavy with guilt. They've seen us talking. They think you're involved, or at least that you know something. And they'll use you to get to me. The room seemed to close in around me, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest. This wasn't just about James anymore. I was in danger too, and it was because of him. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James looked at me, his eyes filled with desperation. We need to leave. Tonight. If we stay, they'll come for both of us. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was the man who had broken my heart, who had disappeared from my life without explanation. And now, after all this time, he was asking me to trust him again, asking me to run with him from people who could destroy us both. My instinct screamed at me to walk away, to leave him to deal with the mess he'd created and protect myself. But as I looked at him, saw the fear in his eyes, the weight of his regret, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Okay, I whispered, my heart pounding. But if we're doing this, you have to tell me everything. No more secrets. James nodded, his expression solemn. I promise. Would you trust James after everything he's done? Or walk away to protect yourself? What do you think Claire should do? Let us know your thoughts below. We packed quickly, our movements quiet but rushed, every sound making my heart race. My hands trembled as I shoved clothes into a bag, glancing nervously toward the door every few seconds. I had no idea how much time we had before the men who had been threatening James showed up again. It could be hours, or it could be minutes. James was moving like a man who had done this before, packing only what we needed, leaving behind anything that could slow us down. As I watched him, the reality of our situation sank deeper into my bones. I was about to run from criminals. With the man who had broken my heart, my life had turned into a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. We'll take my car, James said, throwing the last of his things into a black duffel bag. We need to leave the city before nightfall. Where are we going? I asked, zipping up my own bag. There's a cabin a few hours from here, James replied, his voice tense. It's off the grid. No one will find us there. We can figure out our next move once we're safe. I nodded, even though the thought of running away to some remote cabin with James felt like stepping into the unknown. I wanted to ask him more, how long we'd be gone, what the plan was after we reached the cabin, but I knew now wasn't the time for questions. We needed to move. As we made our way down the hallway, I couldn't help but glance around, half expecting one of the men in suits to appear at the end of the corridor. My heart pounded in my chest, and every creak of the floorboards under our feet sent a fresh wave of panic through me. When we reached the parking garage, James hurried ahead to unlock his car. He scanned the area quickly, his eyes darting to the corners of the garage, as if he were expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Get in," he said, his voice low and urgent. I climbed into the passenger seat, throwing my bag into the back as James slid behind the wheel. He started the engine, pulling out of the garage with one last glance over his shoulder. We drove in silence for the first half hour, my mind racing with everything that had happened over the past few days. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life play out, not my own. The city lights faded behind us as we headed toward the countryside, the roads growing darker and more isolated. After a while, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "James," I said quietly, staring out the window, "you need to tell me everything. What are we really running from?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his grip tightened on the steering wheel. "After I left the city," he began, his voice low, "I got involved with a group that was running a money laundering scheme. It was supposed to be a short-term job, just something to make quick money and then get out. But once I was in, I couldn't get out. They had too much control, and by the time I realized how dangerous it was too late." I swallowed hard, feeling a wave of nausea. What kind of people are we talking about? Organized crime, James said bluntly. Mobsters, criminals. These people don't mess around, Claire. They have connections everywhere. Police, government, you name it. That's why going to the authorities isn't an option. I'm a liability to them now, and they won't stop until they get what they want. What do they want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James exhaled, glancing at me briefly before looking back at the road. I stole a ledger from them. It has all the information about their operations, names, bank accounts, deals. If that information gets into the wrong hands, it could bring their entire operation crashing down. My heart pounded. And they think you're going to hand it over to the police? James nodded grimly. I've been trying to figure out how to use it as leverage. If I give it to the authorities, I might be able to cut a deal, get protection. But right now, I'm just trying to stay alive long enough to make a move. The car's headlights cut through the dark road, but I felt like I was drowning in shadows. And they know about me, I said, my voice shaking. They think I'm involved. James's face tightened. I didn't mean for you to get dragged into this, Claire. But they saw us talking, and now they think you're part of it. They'll come after you to get to me. Fear clamped down on my chest. I had suspected that I was in danger, but hearing it confirmed by James made it all the more real. I was now a target, caught in the crosshairs of something far bigger than myself. Do you still have the ledger? I asked. James hesitated, then nodded. It's hidden. I didn't bring it with me, but I know where it is. Once we're safe, I can figure out the next step. I stared at him, my mind racing with the weight of everything he had just told me. This was far more dangerous than I had realized. And now I was tied to James in a way I couldn't escape. We can't keep running forever, I said softly. What's the endgame, James? What happens after we get to the cabin? He clenched his jaw. I don't know yet, but right now, staying alive is the priority. The words hung heavy in the air between us. I turned my gaze back to the window, my thoughts swirling with fear, doubt, and the painful memories of our past. We drove for what felt like hours, the landscape growing darker and more isolated as we moved further from the city. Eventually, the road turned into a narrow dirt path, lined with trees that loomed over us like sentinels in the night. This is it, James said, pulling the car to a stop in front of an old, run-down cabin hidden deep within the woods. The place looked abandoned, the windows dark, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. I climbed out of the car, my heart still pounding in my chest as I looked around. The cabin was small, barely more than a shack, but it felt remote enough to keep us hidden, at least for a while. James led the way inside, flipping on a small lamp that illuminated the dusty interior. The cabin was bare, just a few pieces of old furniture and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was cold, silent, and unsettling. We'll be safe here for now, James said, setting his bag down on the floor. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. My nerves were shot, and every creak of the cabin made me feel like we were being watched. What if they find us? I asked, unable to keep the fear out of my voice. They won't, James said firmly. No one knows about this place. We'll be fine. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that he could protect us. But deep down, I knew that the people after him wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And now, my life was tied to his in a way I never could have imagined. As the night stretched on, I sat in the dimly lit cabin, my mind racing with questions. How had my life spiraled into this? How had I gone from moving into a new apartment to running from dangerous criminals with my ex-boyfriend? And more than anything, I couldn't stop wondering. Was James really telling me everything? Or was there still more he was hiding? Do you think James is still keeping secrets? Will the cabin really keep them safe? Share your thoughts on what happens next. The silence in the cabin was unbearable, thick with tension and uncertainty. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the trees outside sent my nerves on edge. I sat by the window, staring out into the pitch-black woods, my thoughts swirling in endless circles. James sat across from me, quiet and lost in his own world. His face was a mask of determination, but there was something else beneath it, something fragile. Fear, maybe. Regret. We hadn't spoken much since arriving at the cabin, both of us too consumed by the gravity of the situation. We were safe for now, but the question that loomed over us was for how long? What's our next move? I asked finally, breaking the silence. James looked up, as if pulled from a deep thought. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, his phone buzzed. The sound shattered the fragile quiet in the room. He grabbed it from the table and stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. I stood, my heart already picking up speed. Who is it? He didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the phone, the tension in his body sharp and unmistakable. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low. It's them. A cold wave of fear swept through me. They found us? They're close, he muttered, tossing the phone onto the table. His hands clenched into fists as he stood and paced the room. They're giving me one last chance. If I don't hand over the ledger, they'll come for both of us. The air seemed to thicken around me, making it hard to breathe. The danger was no longer some abstract threat on the horizon. It was here, closing in on us. What are we going to do? I asked, my voice trembling. James stopped pacing, his eyes meeting mine. We can't stay here. I need to give them the ledger, but I have to make sure you get out first. I can't risk them using you to get to me. No, I said quickly, stepping toward him. We can figure this out. We can run again, go to the police, or... There's no time for that. He cut me off, his voice strained with urgency. You don't understand how dangerous these people are, Claire. If they catch us together, they'll use you as leverage, and I won't be able to stop them. The only chance you have is to leave, right now. The thought of leaving him, of running while he stayed behind, made my heart ache. After everything that had happened between us, after the years of pain and confusion, I didn't want to abandon him. But deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't outrun these people forever. You're going to turn yourself in? I whispered, my voice breaking. James nodded, his face pale but resolute. I'll give them what they want. But I need you to go, Claire. If something happens to you because of me... He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. The guilt of his past was already crushing him. Losing me would destroy him. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. This wasn't the time to fall apart. Where do I go? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. There's a train station about 20 miles from here, James said. Head there and take the first train out. Go as far as you can and don't come back. I'll find a way to contact you when it's safe. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that we'd both survive this, that he'd somehow manage to walk away from the mess he was in. But part of me knew this might be the last time I saw him. I don't want to leave you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. James's expression softened, and for the briefest moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The man who had made me feel safe, who had promised me a future that never came. I know, he said quietly, stepping closer, but you have to. If you don't, none of this will matter. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything hanging between us. I could feel the tears threatening to spill over, but I held them back. I couldn't break down now, not when everything was on the line. Promise me you'll be careful, I said, my voice cracking. James nodded, his jaw clenched. I promise. I didn't believe him, not fully, but I didn't have a choice. The drive to the train station felt like an eternity. The woods pressed in on all sides, the road dark and narrow, every shadow a potential threat. I couldn't stop thinking about James, about the danger he was in, about whether I'd ever see him again. The fear gnawed at me, but I pushed it down, focusing on getting to the station, getting out. When I finally arrived, the train station was nearly deserted, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. I parked the car and rushed toward the platform, my heart pounding in my chest. There were only a handful of people waiting, and the sound of an approaching train echoed in the distance. I stood there, clutching my bag, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I'd lose what little resolve I had left. The train arrived, and I boarded, finding an empty seat by the window. As the train pulled away, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had left James behind. I had run, and now I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. Hours passed. The train carried me further and further from the nightmare I'd been living, but the fear and uncertainty lingered like a shadow. I couldn't stop thinking about what James was facing, about the danger that had been creeping toward us from the moment I'd seen him again. I wanted to believe he could handle it, that he'd survive, and we'd find a way out of this together. But the rational part of me knew that the odds were against him. These people, these criminals, wouldn't just let him walk away. They wanted the ledger, but they wanted James too, and I wasn't sure which mattered more to them. As the train sped through the night, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I had made it out. I had escaped, but James was still in the heart of the storm, and I had no idea if he'd survive it. Days passed, and I waited. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped into my throat, hoping it was him, but it never was. I checked the news constantly, looking for any sign of what had happened, any clue as to whether the mob had been taken down, whether James had survived. But there was nothing. Silence. A week later, I found myself standing in front of the train station again, the memory of that night still fresh in my mind. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe a sign, maybe closure, maybe James, waiting for me like he promised he'd find a way to do. But the platform was empty, and I was alone. I walked away, the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on me. I didn't know if James was dead or alive. I didn't know if the danger had passed or if it was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. All I knew was that he was gone, and with him, the last piece of my heart that I hadn't realized I was still holding on to. Do you think James survived? Could you have left someone behind to save yourself? Share your thoughts on this bittersweet ending.